Part 3 of Chapter 13 of Aequanimitas by Sir William Osler. This is a Librivox Recording. All Librivox Recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Luke Sartor. Part 3 of Chapter 13 Medicine in the 19th Century. Diphtheria. Since the discovery of the germ of this disease and our knowledge of the conditions of its transmission, and the discovery of the antitoxin, there has been a great reduction in its prevalence and an equally remarkable reduction in the mortality. The more careful isolation of the sick, the thorough disinfection of the clothing, the rigid scrutiny of the milder cases of throat disorder, a more stringent surveillance in the period of convalescence, and the routine examination of the throats of school children, these are the essential measures by which the prevalence of the disease has been very markedly diminished. The great danger is in the mild cases, in which the disease has perhaps not been suspected, and in which the children may be walking about and even going to school. Such patients are often a source of widespread infection. The careful attention given by mothers to teeth and mouth of children is also an important factor. In children with recurring attacks of tonsillitis, in whom the tonsils are enlarged, the organs should be removed. Through these measures, the incidence of the disease has been very greatly reduced. Pneumonia. While there has been a remarkable diminution in the prevalence of a large number of all the acute infections, one disease not only holds its own, but seems even to have increased in its virulence. In the mortality bills, pneumonia is an easy second to tuberculosis. Indeed, in many cities the death rate is now higher, and it has become, to use the phrase of Bunyan, the captain of the men of death. It attacks particularly the intemperate, the feeble, and the old, though every year a large number of robust, healthy individuals succumb. So frequent is pneumonia at advanced periods of life that to die of it has been said to be the natural end of old men in this country. In many ways, too, it is a satisfactory disease, if one may use such an expression. It is not associated with much pain, except at the onset. The battle is brief and short, and a great many old persons succumb to it easily and peacefully. We know the cause of the disease, we know only too well its symptoms, but the enormous fatality, from 20 to 25%, speaks only too plainly of the futility of our means of cure. And yet in no disease has there been so great a revolution in treatment. The patient is no longer drenched to death with drugs, or bled to a point where the resisting powers of nature are exhausted. We are not without hope, too, that in the future an antidote may be found to the toxins of the disease, and of late there have been introduced several measures of great value in supporting the weakness of the heart, a special danger in the old and debilitated. Hydrophobia. Rabies, a remarkable, and in certain countries a widespread, disease of animals, when transmitted to man by the bite of rabid dogs, wolves, etc., is known as hydrophobia. The specific germ is unknown, but by a series of brilliant observations, Pasteur showed 1. That the poison has certain fixed and peculiar properties in connection with the nervous system, 2. That susceptible animals could be rendered refractory to the disease, or incapable of taking it, by a certain method of inoculation, and 3. That an animal unprotected and inoculated with a dose of the virus sufficient to cause the disease may, by the injection of proper anti-rabic treatment, escape. Supported by these facts, Pasteur began a system of treatment of hydrophobia in man, and a special institute was founded in Paris for the purpose. When carried out promptly, the treatment is successful in an immense majority of all cases, and the mortality in persons bitten by animals proved to be rabid, who have subsequently had the anti^rabic treatment, have been reduced to less than 0.5%. The disease may be stamped out in dogs by careful quarantine of suspected animals, and by a thoroughly carried out muzzling order. Malaria. Among the most remarkable of modern discoveries is the cause of malarial fever, one of the great maladies of the world, and a prime obstacle to the settlement of Europeans in tropical regions. Until 1880 the cause was quite obscure. It was known that the disease prevailed chiefly in marshy districts in the autumn, and that the danger of infection was greatest in the evening and at night, and that it was not directly contagious. In 1880 a French army surgeon, Laveran, discovered in the red blood corpuscles small bodies which have proven to be the specific germ of the disease. They are not bacteria, but little animal bodies resembling the amoeba, tiny little portions of protoplasm. The parasite in its earliest form is a small, clear, ring-shaped body inside the red blood corpuscle, upon which it feeds, gradually increasing in size and forming within itself blackish grains out of the colouring matter of the corpuscle. When the little parasite reaches a certain size, it begins to divide or multiply, and an enormous number of these breaking up at the same time give off poison in the blood, which causes the paroxysms of fever. During what is known as the chill, in the intermittent fever, for example, one can always find these dividing parasites. Several different forms of the parasites have been found, corresponding to different varieties of malaria. Parasites of a very similar nature exist abundantly in birds. Ross, an army surgeon in India, found that the spread of this parasite from bird to bird was effected through the intervention of the mosquito. The parasites reach maturity in certain cells of the coats of the stomach of these insects, and develop into peculiar thread-like bodies, many of which ultimately reach the salivary glands, from which, as the insect bites, they pass with the secretion of the glands into the wound. From this as a basis, numerous observers have worked out the relation of the mosquito to malaria in the human subject. Briefly stated, the disease is transmitted chiefly by certain varieties of the mosquito, particularly the Anopheles. The ordinary Culex, which is present chiefly in the northern states, does not convey the disease. The Anopheles sucks the blood from a person infected with malaria, takes in a certain number of parasites, which undergo development in the body of the insect, the final outcome of which is numerous small thread-like structures which are found in numbers in the salivary glands. From this point, when the mosquito bites another individual, they pass into his blood, infect the system, and in this way the disease is transmitted. Two very striking experiments may be mentioned. The Italian observers have repeatedly shown that Anopheles, which have sucked blood from patients suffering from malaria, when sent to a non-malarial region and there allowed to bite perfectly healthy persons, have transmitted the disease. But a very crucial experiment was made a short time ago. Mosquitoes which had bitten malarial patients in Italy were sent to London and there allowed to bite Mr. Manson, son of Dr. Manson, who really suggested the mosquito theory of malaria. This gentleman had not lived out of England, and there is no acute malaria in London. He had been a perfectly healthy, strong man. In a few days following the bites of the infected mosquitoes, he had a typical attack of malarial fever. The other experiment, though, of a different character, is quite as convincing. In certain regions about Rome, in the Campagna, malaria is so prevalent that in the autumn almost everyone in the district is attacked, particularly if he is a newcomer. Dr. Sambron and a friend lived in this district from June 1st to September 1st, 1900. The test was whether they could live in this exceedingly dangerous climate for the 3 months without catching malaria, if they used stringent precautions against the bites of mosquitoes. For this purpose, the hut in which they lived was thoroughly wired, and they slept with the greatest care under netting. Both of these gentlemen at the end of the period had escaped the disease. The importance of these studies cannot be overestimated. They explain the relation of malaria to marshy districts, the seasonal incidence of the disease, the nocturnal infection, and many other hitherto obscure problems. More important still, they point out clearly the way by which malaria may be prevented. First, the recognition that any individual with malaria is a source of danger in a community, so that he must be thoroughly treated with quinine. Secondly, the importance of the draining of marshy districts and ponds in which the mosquitoes breed. And thirdly, that even in the most infected regions persons may escape the disease by living in thoroughly protected houses, in this way escaping the bites of mosquitoes. Venereal diseases. These continue to embarrass the social economist and to perplex and distress the profession. The misery and ill health which they cause are incalculable, and the pity of it is that the cross is not always borne by the offender, but innocent women and children share the penalties. The gonorrheal infection, so common, and often so little heeded, is a cause of much disease in parts other than those first affected. Syphilis claims its victims in every rank of life, at every age, and in all countries. We now treat it more thoroughly, but all attempts to check its ravages have been fruitless. Physicians have two important duties, the incessant preaching of continence to young men, and scrupulous care, in every case, that the disease may not be a source of infection to others, and that by thorough treatment the patient may be saved from the serious late nervous manifestations. We can also urge that in the interests of public health, venereal diseases, like other infections, shall be subject to supervision by the state. The opposition to measures tending to the restriction of these diseases is most natural. On the one hand, from women, who feel that it is an aggravation of a shocking injustice and wrong to their sex; on the other, from those who feel the moral guilt in a legal recognition of the evil. It is appalling to contemplate the frightful train of miseries which a single diseased woman may entail, not alone on her associates, but on scores of the innocent, whose bitter cry should make the opponents of legislation feel that any measures of restriction, any measures of registration, would be preferable to the present disgraceful condition which makes of some Christian cities open brothels and allows the purest homes to be invaded by the most loathsome of all diseases — leprosy. Since the discovery of the germ of this terrible disease, systematic efforts have been made to improve the state of its victims and to promote the study of the conditions under which the disease prevails. The English Leprosy Commission has done good work in calling attention to the widespread prevalence of the disease in India and in the East. From this country, leprosy has been introduced into San Francisco by the Chinese, and into the northwestern states by the Norwegians, and there are foci of the disease in the southern states, particularly Louisiana, and in the province of New Brunswick. The problem has an additional interest, since the annexation of Hawaii and the Philippine Islands, in both of which places leprosy prevails extensively. By systematic measures of inspection and the segregation of affected individuals the disease can readily be held in check. It is not likely ever to increase among native Americans, or again gain such a foothold as it had in the Middle Ages. Puerperal fever. Perhaps one of the most striking of all victories of preventive medicine has been the almost total abolition of so-called childbed fever from the maternity hospitals and from private practice. In many institutions the mortality after childbirth was 5 or 6%, indeed sometimes as high as 10%, whereas today, owing entirely to proper antiseptic precautions, the mortality has fallen to 0.3% to 0.4%. The recognition of the contagiousness of puerperal fever was the most valuable contribution to medical science made by Oliver Wendell Holmes. There had been previous suggestions by several writers, but his essay on the contagiousness of puerperal fever, published in 1843, was the first strong, clear, logical statement of the case. Semmelweis, a few years later, added the weight of a large practical experience to the side of the contagiousness, but the full recognition of the causes of the disease was not reached until the recent antiseptic views had been put into practical effect. The New School of Medicine. The 19th century has witnessed a revolution in the treatment of disease, and the growth of a new school of medicine. The old schools, regular and homeopathic, put their trust in drugs, to give which was the alpha and the omega of their practice. For every symptom there were a score or more of medicines, vile, nauseous compounds in one case, bland, harmless dilutions in the other. The characteristic of the new school is firm faith in a few good, well-tried drugs, little or none in the great mass of medicines still in general use. Imperative drugging, the ordering of medicine in any and every malady, is no longer regarded as the chief function of the doctor. Naturally, when the entire conception of the disease was changed, there came a corresponding change in our therapeutics. In no respect is this more strikingly shown than in our present treatment of fever, say of the common typhoid fever. During the first quarter of the century, the patients were bled, blistered, purged and vomited, and dosed with mercury, antimony, and other compounds to meet special symptoms. During the second quarter, the same, with variations in different countries. After 1850, bleeding became less frequent, and the experiments of the Paris and Vienna schools began to shake the belief in the control of fever by drugs. During the last quarter, sensible doctors have reached the conclusion that typhoid fever is not a disease to be treated with medicines, but that in a large proportion of all cases, diet, nursing and bathing meet the indications. There is active, systematic, careful, watchful treatment, but not with drugs. The public has not yet been fully educated to this point, and medicines have sometimes to be ordered for the sake of their friends, and it must be confessed that there are still in the ranks antiques who would insist on a dose of some kind every few hours. The battle against polypharmacy, or the use of a large number of drugs, of the action of which we know little, yet we put them into bodies of the action of which we know less, has not been fought to a finish. There have been two contributing factors on the side of progress: the remarkable growth of the sceptical spirit, fostered by Paris, Vienna and Boston physicians, and, above all, the valuable lesson of homeopathy, the infinitesimals of which certainly could not do harm, and quite as certainly could not do good, yet nobody has ever claimed that the mortality among homeopathic practitioners was greater than among those of the regular school. A new school of practitioners has arisen which cares nothing for homeopathy and less for so-called allopathy. It seeks to study rationally and scientifically the action of drugs, old and new. It is more concerned that a physician shall know how to apply the few great medicines which all have to use, such as quinine, iron, mercury, iodide of potassium, opium and digitalis, than that he should employ a multiplicity of remedies the action of which is extremely doubtful. The growth of scientific pharmacology, by which we now have many active principles instead of crude drugs, and the discovery of the art of making medicines palatable, have been of enormous aid in rational practice. There is no limit to the possibility of help from the scientific investigation of the properties and actions of drugs. At any day the new chemistry may give to us remedies of extraordinary potency, and of as much usefulness as cocaine. There is no reason why we should not, even in the vegetable world, find for certain diseases specifics of virtue fully equal to that of quinine in the malarial fevers. One of the most striking characteristics of the modern treatment of disease is the return to what used to be called the natural methods. Diet, exercise, bathing, and massage. There probably never has been a period in the history of the profession when the value of diet in the prevention and cure of disease was more fully recognized. Dyspepsia, the besetting malady of this country, is largely due to improper diet, imperfectly prepared and too hastily eaten. One of the great lessons to be learned is that the preservation of health depends in great part upon food well cooked and carefully eaten. A common cause of ruined digestion, particularly in young girls, is the eating of sweets between meals and the drinking of the abominations dispensed in the chemists' shops in the form of ice cream sodas, etc. Another frequent cause of ruined digestion in business men is the hurried meal at the lunch counter. And a third factor, most important of all, illustrates the old maxim that more people are killed by overeating and drinking than by the sword. Sensible people have begun to realize that alcoholic excesses lead inevitably to impaired health. A man may take 4 or 5 drinks of whisky a day, or even more, and thinks perhaps that he transacts his business better with that amount of stimulant. But it only too frequently happens that early in the 5th decade, just as business or political success is assured, Bacchus hands in heavy bills for payment in the form of serious disease of the arteries or of the liver, or there is a general breakdown. With the introduction of light beer, there has been not only less intemperance, but a reduction in the number of cases of organic disease of the heart, liver and stomach caused by alcohol. While temperance in the matter of alcoholic drinks is becoming a characteristic of Americans, intemperance in the quantity of food taken is almost the rule. Adults eat far too much, and physicians are beginning to recognize that the early degenerations, particularly of the arteries and of the kidneys, leading to Bright's disease, which were formerly attributed to alcohol, are due in large part to too much food. Nursing. Perhaps in no particular does 19th century practice differ from that of the preceding centuries, more than in the greater attention which is given to the personal comfort of the patient and to all the accessories comprised in the art of nursing. The physician has in the trained nurse an assistant who carries out his directions with a watchful care, is on the lookout for danger signals, and with accurate notes enables him to estimate the progress of a critical case from hour to hour. The intelligent, devoted women who have adopted the profession of nursing are not only in their ministrations a public benefaction, but they lighten the anxieties which form so large a part of the load of the busy doctor. Massage and hydrotherapy have taken their places as most important measures of relief in many chronic conditions, and the latter has been almost universally adopted as the only safe means of combating the high temperatures of the acute fevers. Within the past quarter of a century the value of exercise in the education of the young has become recognized. The increase in the means of taking wholesome out-of-door exercise is remarkable, and should show in a few years an influence in the reduction of the nervous troubles in young persons. The prophylactic benefit of systematic exercise, taken in moderation by persons of middle age, is very great. Golf and the bicycle have in the past few years materially lowered the average incomes which doctors in this country derive from persons under 40. From the senile contingent, those above this age, the average income has for a time been raised by these exercises, as a large number of persons have been injured by taking up sports which may be vigorously pursued with safety only by those with young arteries. Of 3 departures in the art of healing, brief mention may be made. The use of the extracts of certain organs, or of the organs themselves, in disease, is as old as the days of the Romans, but an extraordinary impetus has been given to the subject by the discovery of the curative powers of the extract of the thyroid gland in the diseases known as cretinism and myxoedema. The brilliancy of the results in these diseases has had no parallel in the history of modern medicine, but it cannot be said that in the use of the extracts of other organs for disease the results have fulfilled the sanguine expectations of many. There was not, in the first place, the same physiological basis, and practitioners have used these extracts too indiscriminately and without sufficient knowledge of the subject. Secondly, as I have already mentioned, we possess a sure and certain hope that for many of the acute infections antitoxins will be found. A third noteworthy feature in modern treatment has been a return to psychical methods of cure, in which faith in something is suggested to the patient. After all, faith is the great lever of life. Without it, man can do nothing. With it, even with a fragment, as a grain of mustard seed, all things are possible to him. Faith in us, faith in our drugs and methods, is the great stock in trade of the profession. In one pan of the balance, put the pharmacopoeias of the world, all the editions from Dioscorides to the last issue of the United States Dispensatory. Heap them on the scales as did Euripides his books, in the celebrated contest in the Frogs. In the other, put the simple faith with which from the days of the Pharaohs until now the children of men have swallowed the mixtures these works describe, and the bulky tomes will kick the beam. It is the aurum potabile, the touchstone of success in medicine. As Galen says, confidence and hope do more good than physic. He cures most in whom most are confident. That strange compound of charlatan and philosopher, Paracelsus, encouraged his patients to have a good faith, a strong imagination, and they shall find the effects. While we doctors often overlook or are ignorant of our own faith cures, we are just a wee bit too sensitive about those performed outside our ranks. We have never had, and cannot expect to have, a monopoly in this panacea, which is open to all, free as the sun, and which may make of every one, in certain cases, as was the Lacedaemonian of Homer's day, a good physician out of nature's grace. Faith in the gods or in the saints cures one, faith in little pills another, hypnotic suggestion a third, faith in a plain, common doctor a fourth. In all ages the prayer of faith has healed the sick, and the mental attitude of the suppliant seems to be of more consequence than the powers to which the prayer is addressed. The cures in the temples of Aesculapius, the miracles of the saints, the remarkable cures of those noble men, the Jesuit missionaries in this country, the modern miracles at Lourdes and at St. Anne de Beaupré in Quebec, and the wonder workings of the so-called Christian Scientists are often genuine and must be considered in discussing the foundations of therapeutics. We physicians use the same power every day. If a poor lass, paralyzed apparently, helpless, bedridden for years, comes to me, having worn out in mind, body and estate, a devoted family, if she in a few weeks or less by faith in me and faith alone takes up her bed and walks, the saints of old could not have done more. Saint Annie and many others can scarcely today do less. We enjoy, I say, no monopoly in the faith business. The faith with which we work, the faith indeed which is available today in everyday life, has its limitations. It will not raise the dead. It will not put in a new eye in place of a bad one, as it did to an Iroquois Indian boy for one of the Jesuit fathers, nor will it cure cancer or pneumonia or knit a bone. But in spite of these 19th century restrictions, such as we find it, faith is a most precious commodity, without which we should be very badly off. Hypnotism, introduced by Mesmer in the 18th century, has had several revivals as a method of treatment during the 19th century. The first careful study of it was made by Braid, a Manchester surgeon, who introduced the terms hypnotism, hypnotic, and nervous sleep. But at this time no very great measure of success followed its use in practice, except perhaps in the case of an Anglo-Indian surgeon, James S. Dale, who, prior to the introduction of anaesthesia, had performed 261 surgical operations upon patients in a state of hypnotic unconsciousness. About 1880 the French physicians, particularly Charcot and Bernheim, took up the study, and since that time hypnotism has been extensively practised. It may be defined as a subjective psychical condition, which Braid called nervous sleep, resembling somnambulism, in which, as Shakespeare says, in the description of Lady Macbeth, the person receives at once the benefit of sleep and does the effects or acts of watching or waking. Therapeutically, the important fact is that the individual's natural susceptibility to suggestion is increased, and this may hold after the condition of hypnosis has passed away. The condition of hypnosis is usually itself induced by a suggestion, requesting the subject to close the eyes, to think of sleep, and the operator then repeats 2 or 3 times sentences suggesting sleep, and suggesting that the limbs are getting heavy and that he is feeling drowsy. During this state it has been found that the subjects are very susceptible to suggestion. Too much must not be expected of hypnotism, and the claims which have been made for it have been too often grossly exaggerated. It seems, as it has been recently well put, that hypnotism at best permits of making suggestions more effective for good or bad than can be done upon one in his waking state. It is found to be of very little use in organic disease. It has been helpful in some cases of hysteria, in certain functional spasmodic affections of the nervous system, in the vicious habits of childhood, and in suggesting to the victims of alcohol and drugs that they should get rid of their inordinate desires. It has been used successfully in certain cases for the relief of labour pains and in surgical operations, but on the whole, while a valuable agent in a few cases, it has scarcely fulfilled the expectations of its advocates. It is a practice not without serious dangers, and should never be performed except in the presence of a third person, while its indiscriminate employment by ignorant persons should be prevented by law. One mode of faith healing in modern days, which passes under the remarkable name of Christian Science, is probably nothing more than mental suggestion under another name. The patient is told to be calm, and is assured that all will go well, that he must try to aid the healer by believing that what is told him is true. The healer then, quietly but firmly, asserts and reiterates that there is no pain, no suffering, that it is disappearing, that relief will come, that the patient is getting well. This is precisely the method which Bernheim used to use with such success with his hypnotic patients at Nancy, iterating and reiterating in a most wearisome way that the disease would disappear and the patient would feel better. As has been pointed out by a recent writer, Dr. Harry Marshall, the chief basis for the growth of Christian Science is that which underlies every popular fallacy. Oliver Wendell Holmes outlined very clearly the factors concerned, showing a. how easily abundant facts can be collected to prove anything whatsoever, b. how insufficient, exalted wisdom, immaculate honesty, and vast general acquirements are to prevent an individual from having the most primitive ideas upon subjects out of his line of thought, and finally demonstrating the boundless credulity and excitability of mankind upon subjects connected with medicine. End of Chapter 13. Medicine in the 19th Century. Recording by Luke Sartor, Griffith, New South Wales,